All right, so now we're on to the role of American political parties, and this is specific to the United States, so this really can't be extrapolated outward anywhere else, so this is really just about the USA. All right, so first, political parties are active year-round. They don't just get going right when there's a presidential election or right around November when elections typically take place at the local level. They are constantly active, and depending on what's going on, whether they're the party in power or they're the party in basically in removal and they're trying to get their people elected in office, can change what activities they do during the year. They try to keep people informed, and here's the crazy thing, keep them interested in issues and the candidate. So it's very hard to get a candidate elected if no one really cares about what's going on. So a big thing that parties do is basically put the information out there in a way that people will more readily absorb and get more enthusiastic about it. It's very hard to get candidates or anybody else really, like a potential voter, excited about fiscal policy reform, but they will pick other issues that really get people going, like, hey, lower taxes. They'll say lower taxes, lower taxes, lower taxes. But what they're really talking about is fiscal policy and tax reform overall, and that's a way to get people interested. It's more visceral. It's just more easily accessible for the average voter. So they're not going to go out with super complex messages. They're going to do basic advertising, very simplistic kind of stuff to kind of get a broad spectrum of people interested in the candidates and the issues, hopefully. They try to make sure the party's elected officials do a good job. So it doesn't really help you if you're a political party and the guy that you help get elected turns out to be a schmuck and they can't really get anything done, or they act like a fool when they're in the office, or they do things like commit crimes or engage in corruption, all those things. So one of the strange things about this is the party actually kind of acts like a watchdog on the candidates themselves, even their own candidates. They also do this a lot. They criticize the actions of the opposing party. That feels like during the election time period, that's all they do. That's their only job. We're not going to talk about our guy. We're going to talk about the other guy, and that just all the negative advertising. They get the information out there. Reince Priebus, when he was the RNC chair, now he's working with the Trump administration. He would get on the air every time he get interviewed, talk bad about Hillary Clinton because that was his job. He said things that the other party did and said why they were bad. What Clinton's doing is bad. What's happening here is bad. What's happening with Emailgate is bad. All this stuff talking down the opposing party. All right, so here's the nomination process in sum. So this is just for the president. This is just how this works for the presidency, and this is in descending order of least Democratic to most Democratic. So the first method to nominate a party member for your party to run for president could be a caucus. A caucus is a closed meeting of political party members, and it's used to select candidates or set party policy. So in the case of the presidential election, there are, like the state of Iowa has caucuses. Caucuses in Iowa are basically party members getting together and voting. Now, we'll look it up later, but there's some interesting current events about caucuses and how they're related to Bernie Sanders' ability to get elected versus Hillary Clinton's, and we'll talk about that later. Then you have primary elections. These are used in general to narrow the field of potential candidates before the general election. So basically, it's more open. There's more people able to vote. And a caucus is only party members, and that's it. And you have to go to special places and cast your vote, sometimes by raising your hand. It's not like a secret balloting system. It's less democratic. So there's two kinds of primaries. The first one's a closed primary, where only declared party members may vote. So basically, if I'm a Republican in North Carolina and I want to engage in a caucus, in a primary like they do in North Carolina, I would go and I would vote because I'm a declared Republican. If I'm a Democrat in North Carolina, I can't do that. I can't vote in the Republican primary at all. For me to do so would be illegal. Now, in an open primary, all voters may participate regardless of party affiliation. So in those states that have open primaries, you can be Republican and vote in the Democratic primary. Very different. Now, here's where some shenanigans can happen. So let's say in 2020, the presumptive Republican nominee will be Donald Trump because he's the president. All sitting presidents are the presumptive nominee for the next election if they're eligible. So Trump will be eligible for a second term. He's the presumptive nominee of the Republican side. If I'm Republican, but I still want to have an influence on the primaries, if I'm in an open primary state, I can go vote for the Democrat. Now, if I'm a Republican and I'm voting in the Democratic primaries, which is legal in the primary states, am I going to pick the strong Democrat candidate to vote for or the weak one? Well, I might pick the weak candidate, so then Trump goes up against a weak candidate. That's where some shenanigans, some little bit of dishonesty can happen, and it does happen on both sides back and forth. Finally, delegates cast votes to officially select the party's candidate at the national convention. So after all the primaries are done in all the states, delegates are then cast. And depending on what state you're in, the rules can change drastically. You can have open primary, closed primary, caucus. Sometimes it's winner-take-all states for their delegates. Sometimes it's proportional based on the popular vote. All the states are relatively different in how they do this, so there's not really any uniformity. All right, so plurality. That's where no candidate receives a majority of the votes in the primary. The nomination goes to the candidate who receives the most votes among those running. So this is where essentially you could have a situation where, let's say there's 3 big candidates for one party's nomination and nobody gets the vote. Nobody gets to a majority. Who wins? The plurality winner wins, which is a very strange situation. And a lot of this kind of stuff happened with Trump because there were 16 Republican candidates, and he was winning a lot of these primary states, which was only like 30% of the vote. But he had the plurality; he would win most of the votes. So you run into an issue there where, let's say, Trump wins Florida with 36% of the vote. That means that, I'm going to be really bad at math here for a second, 64% of the vote went to other candidates, meaning he did not get the majority. In fact, he got only 36% of the vote. If you only got 36 on a test, you'd be furious. If you got 64%, hey, at least you passed. So more people didn't want Trump than people who did want Trump, but Trump still won. So there you run into an issue where plurality rules don't always represent the majority view. It's just the majority never got together under one candidate to fight off the opposing member in the party. It's a very strange situation in our country and how the primary system works when you have an overabundance of candidates on one side or the other. Now, some states allow for a runoff. So if they'll be like winner take all. They say you have to get a majority or it doesn't count. So basically, a runoff election will happen when the top 2 vote getters didn't get a majority. So let's say it's like the easiest one is 40, 40, and 20. So candidate A gets 40, candidate B gets 40, candidate C gets 20. That means you knock out candidate C, and then you do a second election with just candidates A and B, and you're pretty much guaranteed that one person is going to get at least one more vote than the other, and then you'll have a majority vote, and then they win. Not all states do this. Some do it winner-take-all style. Some do it proportion style based on popular vote. Depends on the state. Now, unaffiliated candidates can get on a ballot sometimes if the voters sign get enough signatures on a petition sheet to support that candidate, but it is a pretty high bar to get on the ballot, depending on what state you're in. Other party roles, they campaign for the candidates. So the parties raise money for the campaign and help get the candidates' views across the public. So a big issue this past election was the fact that Trump wasn't getting a lot of money from the campaign because a lot of the Republicans didn't like him, so they weren't giving him a whole bunch of money. In fact, they thought he was going to lose, so what they were really doing was taking the money and spending it on the congressional and lower-level elections because at least they had a shot at winning those. Even the Republican Party didn't really think Trump had a chance, but he still ended up winning. So they're campaigning for candidates and how money gets spent is a big part of the party role within the Democrat, Republican, even in Green and the Reform and all these various other parties that are in the U.S. Another big thing they do is they inform citizens through pamphlets, speeches, advertising, much like the information portion we talked about earlier. Other party roles, they help manage government. So typically, if you're like Donald Trump's never been president. Most people who become president have never been president, simply by virtue of the fact that it's the highest job in the land, and after that you don't do anything else, and you only get 2 terms to do it. So who do you get in there that knows how to do the job? Well, that's part of the party role. Sometimes they'll do things like, all right, we have a list of people who are exceptional to do this for the transition team. So in between November and January, who's going to come in and kind of make things work better so it's a smooth transition to the new president? Well, usually the party will do that. The party knows those people. They know where they are in government. They know how to move them around, make and recommend the best people for certain jobs that they are best at. And here's another. And this probably it's only one link on this whole chain of things that parties do. They link different levels of government together. So that's one of those things. Parties don't like existing in isolation. So you want the local Republican Party or local Democrat Party linked to the state level Democrat Party, which is then linked to the federal level Republican Party. All those things you want all the various levels of in the individual party linked together. Otherwise, you might have a disconnect going on. You also might have an issue where it's always good to know who's down at the bottom, in the middle, and the top, because sometimes presidents like to pick up people from the states and put them in the national position. So like Nikki Haley was the governor of South Carolina. Well, now she's in the Trump administration. That happened because of the linking of the different levels of government and the party. They're tying them together, so there's a direct path for people in low levels of government to rise up through the party, to make sure that talent isn't missed, to make sure that people who are experts get used and utilized by the party, and that happens because of good communication at different levels within that party. All right, other major party roles. One of the biggest ones that really every party does is their role as a watchdog. And that can be both ways. One, they watch their own party members, make sure they're acting right, just like I talked about earlier. They also do a whole lot of making sure that the other side, when they're in power, don't misuse that power. And if they do, they nail them on it. So anytime Obama did something wrong or did something that people didn't like, guess who were the first people to start shouting as loud as they could? It was Republicans in Congress, because they're the opposing party and party members. Reince Priebus would get on the radio and on the TV shows all the time and talk down the president because he was the opposing party whenever he was doing something that was, in his view, a mistake or a misuse of power. A good example of that would be the executive amnesty ruling that got a lot of flack. Oh, corny jokes. All right, so let's go. How many lips does a flower have? 2 lips. What do you call a banana? I'm sorry, what do you call a shoe that's made out of banana? A slipper. And what is a bear without bees? Ears. And what's at the bottom of the ocean and shaking really badly? A nervous wreck. All right, now that those are done, National Party Organization. So we have the National Committee. These guys are the top dogs. They raise funds for the presidential elections and organize national conventions. So that's the big convention where they actually nominate the president for their party. And they also do other national elections, so like congressional or senatorial campaigns. They help run those as well. But the National Committee really is in charge of organizing and deciding who is going to be the Republican and or Democrat nominee for the Republican or Democrat Party. That's their big job, and they try to make sure that it runs smoothly and that everybody comes together at the end and supports their candidate. Now, the National Convention is it's a big party. That's the first thing it is, but it's a party for the party. The party committee also is setting up the platform, which is essentially the whole idea. What are all our big ideas and what is our big stake in this whole election thing we're doing? These are all our ideas put together. That's a platform. Each individual platform is called a plank. So like on the Republican side, they have a big platform with all these various issues, but they might also say, well, we're pro-life when it comes to abortion. That pro-life stance on abortion is a plank in the Republican platform. We want to lower taxes. That is a plank in the Republican platform. We want to build a wall. That is a plank in the Republican platform. All those things. So this is the DNC convention from 2016. These are some highlight pictures, lots of balloons and Rocky IV style lifting up arms. And there's a Republican. You got Pence, and you got Trump over there. Now the big thing is this is a huge party, and one of the big things you're trying to do, especially on the Republican side this year, there were 16 candidates, and it got messy because, Trump's involved. Trump's very bombastic. He was sometimes offensive, and he was sometimes mean to their candidates. They had to get all those guys to come together to try to make a better situation for the Republican Party, and part of the purpose of these big conventions is to get everybody together. It's kind of like a big family reunion. Like, you hate your uncle, you hate this guy, but you know what, but I like enough of them to where we're all going to be happy in the same room, maybe we'll get along when we leave, that kind of thing. So think of it like a big family reunion with thousands of various party members from either side, depending on what convention you're at. And that's part of the role, is to get everyone to come together. All right, on to the National Party Organization. So, again, platforms and planks. We just went over them. The big thing you want to know, a platform can be gigantic. It can just go on forever. In fact, if you go to the RNC and DNC websites, you will see the platform, and they tend to be fairly long, but the planks are fairly short, and they go in and they don't spend they don't write books about their platform and plank. They're very idyllic. They're made to be simple, easy to communicate. They don't want to mess with them too much. They don't want to confuse the public. They're simple to where you can put them out in a sound bite and tell someone, hey, this is let's say abortion. All right, this is my view on abortion. I'm pro-life. That means I don't believe in abortion unless to save the life of the mother or whatever. And then you move on. They don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. Nitty-gritty is what congressmen do. They want you to understand as a voter the basics of what you're voting for. All right, so here's the list of the organization. You might want to pause it here and go ahead and write this down just so you kind of have an idea what's going on. Because you definitely have to know what's going on with that national committee. because remember how I said the big part is they elect the president. Well, they also help with the Congressional Campaign Committee and the Senatorial Campaign Committee, because that's also federal level elections. But take a moment to write this down. This is how they're linked together in the party framework and chains. You basically want to have all that stuff down just so you understand the dynamic and the flow of how power works in the party organization. State and local organizations. So there's also state committees to elect governors. So there's a Republican, North Carolina Republicans. Guess what? They were trying to get McCrory reelected. North Carolina Democrats, they were trying to get Cooper reelected. And there are party organizations and various legal entities that actually work to promote their candidates. For the NC Senate, NC House, mayors, even candidates that say they're unaffiliated might get support from some of these party networks because they happen to have the same views as that party, or at least enough of that mayor who's independent, their platform matches the Democrat or Republican platform enough to justify them being connected. Local committees, you're talking about at that point mayors, town councilmen, but usually the big candidates, state governors. In our state, we also have the attorney general, various state level officials. You want them, they're going to have some kind of party affiliation. A precinct, and you only need to know this for just knowing the vocab word, it's a division of a city or county that contains a specific number of voters. So a precinct is essentially a certain geographic area that has a certain amount of people, and you're always aiming to have each precinct have close to the same number of people. And they all tend to use the same polling place. And then you got political machines, and you'll learn more about this in US 2 with Tammany Hall and Plunkett and Voss Tweed. And if you have me for a teacher, I'll probably show you Gangs of New York, just because it's a lot of fun. But a political machine is a powerful state or local organization. There's not really a big national organization that you call a political machine that dominate elections in an area. So like the Democrat political machine has a lot of power in Michigan, especially in Detroit. It's very inner city, very poor, so the Democrats have been in control of that for a long time. Places in Texas, very much controlled by Republican organizations. The history of political machines is a history of corruption, but nowadays it's not so much corruption as it is demographics. If you lower socioeconomic status places tend to be more Democrat, higher socioeconomic status places tend to vote Republican, and there's all shades of gray in between. So that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's just where people tend to end up. And that's the lecture, guys. Make sure the guide notes are filled in, and you'll have your assignment at some point today when you finish this lecture.